It's just past 4 in the morning, and inside a rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive in Holmby Hills, a 50-year-old man cannot sleep. He hasn't slept properly in days. A doctor sits beside his bed, moving through a list of drugs meant to shut down a mind that will not stop running. First one sedative, then another, then a third, each one failing where the last one failed. In 11 weeks, this man is supposed to walk onto a stage in London in front of more people than have ever watched him perform in one place. His name is Michael Jackson. In 6 hours, he will be dead. The official story of what happened to Michael Jackson on June 25, 2009, is, on paper, a solved case. A doctor was tried. A doctor was convicted. A cause of death was entered into the record. But if you actually sit with the timeline, hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute, the official story leaves gaps that were never fully closed in court, questions that the conviction answered legally without answering them completely. Who knew what and when? Why the call for help came so late? What was really happening in the room during the 40 minutes nobody can fully account for? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly where the official record stops explaining and the disputes begin, and why, more than 15 years later, people are still arguing about what really happened in that bedroom. And this channel exists for cases exactly like this one, where the headline says solved, but the details underneath tell a messier story. If that's the kind of thing you're here for, go ahead and subscribe now, because this case gets stranger the closer you look. And there's a detail near the end of this video that even a lot of dedicated true crime viewers have never heard laid out clearly. To understand what happened in that bedroom, you have to go back a few weeks, to a soundstage at the Forum in Los Angeles, where Michael Jackson was rehearsing for what was supposed to be the biggest comeback in music history. 50 sold-out shows at London's O2 Arena, announced to a crowd so desperate for tickets that the promoter added 40 extra dates before the general sale even opened. On June 5, 2009, Jackson stood on that stage and rehearsed a song from an album that was already 27 years old, Human Nature, from Thriller, working through it again on June 17th and one final time on June 23rd, 2 days before he died, in what would turn out to be the last full rehearsal of his life. People who were in the room that night said he looked focused, energized even. A photographer who captured those final rehearsal images later said the singer looked no different than in his prime, moving through the choreography like a man reclaiming something he'd lost. But that image, the fit, energized performer 2 days from death, doesn't match everything else that was happening behind the scenes. Because while Jackson was rehearsing on stage, insiders around him were growing worried. On June 18th, just days before that final rehearsal, Jackson didn't show up to work at all. The tour's promoter, Randy Phillips, went to the Carrollwood house himself to find out why, and what he found, according to later testimony, was Jackson's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, present in the home, while Phillips reportedly pressed Jackson to stop seeing another doctor entirely and stop taking whatever that doctor had been giving him. Jackson did eventually show up to rehearsal that night, hours late, visibly shaken. 2 competing versions of Michael Jackson existed in his final weeks, the one performing Human Nature under stage lights, moving like he had something to prove, and the one collapsing behind closed doors, dependent on a rotating cast of physicians to get him through the night. Both of those versions were true at the same time, and only one person was in the room to see which one was winning. Before we get to Murray specifically, it's worth understanding that he wasn't the first doctor to occupy this role in Jackson's life, and that matters, because it's part of what made his presence in that bedroom feel, to investigators later, less like an isolated failure and more like the latest chapter in a much longer pattern. Jackson's history with prescription medication reportedly traced back at least to 1984, when he suffered severe burns during a Pepsi commercial shoot and was prescribed painkillers to manage the pain, the beginning, according to people close to him, of a dependency that would follow him for the rest of his life. Over the following decades, a rotating group of physicians became known, informally and unflatteringly, in entertainment circles as sources of whatever Jackson needed to keep functioning. A dermatologist named Dr. Arnold Klein was among the most publicly scrutinized, having reportedly administered the powerful painkiller Demerol to Jackson repeatedly over the years, according to testimony and reporting that emerged after his death. None of that history excuses what happened in the final hours of June 25th. But it reframes the question this case keeps circling back to. Was Conrad Murray an aberration, a uniquely reckless doctor who did something none of Jackson's other physicians would have done? Or was he simply the doctor who happened to be in the room when a pattern that had been building for 25 years finally reached its breaking point? That person was Conrad Murray. And to understand what happened next, you need to understand what his job actually was. Murray wasn't a longtime family doctor. He was a cardiologist from Las Vegas, hired specifically for the London tour, reportedly on a contract worth around $150,000 a month, a number that would later become one of the most scrutinized details in the entire case, because it raised an uncomfortable question that the trial never fully resolved. Was Murray being paid to keep Michael Jackson healthy, or was he being paid to keep Michael Jackson performing? Those aren't always the same job, and by June of 2009, according to Murray's own later statements, they had become very different things. And there was, at least according to one witness, a warning sign that arrived weeks before anyone in that bedroom needed it. A registered nurse named Sherilyn Lee, who had worked with Jackson on sleep issues earlier that year, testified that Jackson had once asked her directly for propofol by name, and that she refused, explaining to him that the drug was for surgical settings only, and that using it to treat insomnia could kill him. According to her testimony, she told Jackson plainly that she wouldn't be responsible for his death. If her account is accurate, and there's no reason in the trial record to doubt it, then Michael Jackson understood, at some level, exactly what he was asking for, and exactly how dangerous it was, weeks before the night he received it anyway from someone willing to say yes. That detail complicates any version of the story that frames Jackson purely as a passive victim of one reckless doctor. It suggests a man actively seeking out a specific, named drug, and continuing to search until he found someone who wouldn't refuse him. By the early morning hours of June 25th, Jackson's insomnia had become, by all accounts, severe. Murray would later tell investigators that he administered a sequence of sedatives through the night. Valium, then a stronger sedative called lorazepam, then another called midazolam. One after another, each one meant to finally push Jackson into sleep, and each one, according to Murray, failing. Around 10:40 in the morning, after nothing else had worked, Murray said he gave Jackson a drug called propofol. It's a powerful anesthetic, normally used to put patients under general anesthesia before surgery, administered in hospitals, under constant monitoring, by trained anesthesiologists with resuscitation equipment within arm's reach. Murray had reportedly been giving it to Jackson nightly for weeks, in a rented bedroom, with none of that equipment present. He called it, in his own words, Jackson's milk, because Jackson allegedly asked for it by that name. What happened in the roughly 40 minutes after that final dose is the part of this case that has never been fully settled. Not because there's no account of it, but because the account that exists doesn't match the physical evidence as cleanly as it should. Murray said he stepped out of the room briefly. He said he was monitoring Jackson the entire time, but phone records introduced at trial told a different story. Records showing Murray was on his cell phone during portions of that window, including a call to a woman later identified as his girlfriend, a call that phone logs placed at almost the exact time prosecutors argued Jackson stopped breathing. Murray has maintained he never left Jackson unmonitored in any way that mattered. The phone records simply show that a call happened. What they can't show is what Murray was actually watching, or not watching, while it did. At some point, the exact minute is still disputed, Murray says he found Jackson not breathing. and this is where the timeline gets its most damning gap. Emergency dispatch didn't receive a 911 call until 12:21 in the afternoon. But witnesses and later testimony suggested Jackson may have already been in distress significantly earlier than that, with some accounts placing the discovery closer to 11:18, more than an hour before help was formally called. In that gap, according to testimony from Jackson's own children, who were in the house at the time, security staff were reportedly summoned to the room before paramedics were. Jackson's daughter, Paris, who was 11 years old that day, would later describe, in a rare public interview years afterward, running into the room and seeing her father's condition before being pulled away by staff, an account that has never been part of the official legal record, but has shaped how the public understands the human cost sitting underneath the medical and legal facts. Whatever the precise sequence of who was called first, the pattern that emerges from multiple accounts is the same: a household reacting to a medical emergency without the urgency or the equipment that the situation demanded. Murray, according to his own account, attempted CPR, but on a soft bed, not a hard surface which medical experts testified would have made it dramatically less effective. There was no defibrillator in the house. There was no pulse oximeter, the basic monitoring device you'd expect anywhere propofol is being administered, despite Murray's insistence that he was closely monitoring his patient's vital signs throughout the night. An emergency medicine physician who testified at trial called the omission almost impossible to reconcile with any real safety protocol. If you're using an anesthetic that can stop someone's breathing without warning, and you don't have the one device designed to catch that in real time, the question isn't just what happened in that final hour, it's what kind of care Jackson had actually been receiving for the weeks leading up to it. Investigators later tried to reconstruct exactly how much propofol had passed through Jackson's system in the days before his death, and what they found was almost as alarming as the final dose itself. Records and testimony indicated Murray had been administering propofol to Jackson nightly for roughly 6 weeks, using it not as an occasional last resort, but as a routine sleep aid, a use for which the drug was never designed and for which its manufacturer has never approved it. Prosecutors argued this pattern itself was a form of negligence independent of anything that happened on the final morning, that any single one of those 40 or 50 nights could have ended the same way, and that June 25th was simply the night the odds finally caught up. The defense, for its part, argued that Jackson may have self-administered an additional, undocumented dose of propofol or other drugs during a window when Murray briefly stepped away, effectively arguing that Jackson contributed to his own death. The jury ultimately rejected that theory as the primary explanation, but it remains part of the trial record, and it's one of the reasons some observers still argue Murray's conviction, while probably deserved, doesn't fully capture everyone whose decisions contributed to what happened that morning. Paramedics arrived and found Jackson not breathing, with no pulse. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center, where doctors worked on him for over an hour before he was pronounced dead at 2:26 in the afternoon on June 25, 2009. The Los Angeles County coroner later ruled the death a homicide, not in the sense of intentional murder, but in the legal sense that another person's actions directly caused it. The cause, acute propofol intoxication, with the sedative lorazepam listed as a contributing factor. It was, medically, about as clear-cut a cause of death as this genre ever produces, and yet the case was never simple, because a clear cause of death doesn't answer the harder question underneath it: how a hospital-grade anesthetic ended up being administered, night after night, in a bedroom, by one doctor, with no equipment and no oversight, to a man who was supposed to be getting healthier, not more dependent, as his comeback approached. The scale of the public reaction that followed is part of what makes the unanswered details in this case feel so much larger than they might for a less famous victim. Jackson's memorial service at the Staples Center in Los Angeles on July 7, 2009, was broadcast globally and watched by an estimated 1 billion people, one of the largest shared media events in human history, built around a man whose final weeks, it would later become clear, looked nothing like the image being mourned on screen. That gap between the global spectacle of grief and the quiet, poorly monitored bedroom where it actually happened is part of why this case never fully settled into the past the way most legally resolved deaths eventually do. 1 billion people watched the funeral. Almost none of them at the time knew about the missing pulse oximeter, the phone call during the final window, or the email warning that had gone unheeded weeks earlier. That question is where the case moves from medical fact into disputed territory, because almost everyone touched by it tells a different version of how it was allowed to happen. Here's what we know for certain. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter, tried in 2011, and convicted. The jury found that his conduct, administering propofol outside any hospital setting, without monitoring equipment, without informed consent documentation, and with a documented delay before summoning emergency help, constituted criminal negligence. He was sentenced to 4 years, though he was released after serving 2, and California later revoked his medical license. That part of the story isn't a theory. It's a legal finding, decided by a jury that heard weeks of testimony most of us never will. There's one more piece of that internal record worth sitting with, because it's the detail that keeps this case alive in comment sections more than almost any other. In the weeks before Jackson's death, the show's director, Kenny Ortega, a veteran of Jackson's career going back years, sent an email to AEG executives expressing serious concern about Jackson's condition, describing him as fragile and stating he believed Jackson needed to be seen by a physician they could all trust, not simply reassured and kept on schedule. That email became public during the AEG civil trial, and it's significant not because it proves wrongdoing on its own, but because it establishes, in writing, that someone inside the production, someone with direct daily access to Jackson, flagged a problem before it became a tragedy. Separately, it later emerged that AEG had taken out a life insurance policy on Jackson worth roughly $17.5 million as part of insuring the tour, a completely standard practice for productions built around a single headline performer, but a detail that, combined with everything else, has fueled years of speculation online about whether Jackson was worth more to the people around him in a certain condition than in a healthier one. To be clear, there has never been any credible evidence that anyone involved wanted Jackson to die, and the insurance policy on its own proves nothing beyond ordinary business practice. But it's exactly the kind of detail that, once it's public, is almost impossible to fully unsee. But almost immediately, a second dispute opened up alongside the criminal case, a civil one, brought by Jackson's mother, Katherine Jackson, not against Murray but against the concert promoter, AEG Live. The family's argument was straightforward. AEG hired Murray, agreed to that unusually high monthly salary, and, according to the lawsuit, knew or should have known that Jackson was in a fragile physical and psychological state in his final weeks, yet pushed the rehearsal schedule forward anyway because 50 sold-out shows in London represented enormous financial stakes for everyone involved. Internal emails surfaced during that trial showing AEG staff expressing concern about Jackson's condition and his reliance on doctors in the weeks before his death, concern that, according to the family's argument, should have triggered intervention rather than continued pressure to rehearse. In 2013, after a 5-month trial, the jury sided with AEG, finding that while the company did hire Murray, it wasn't unreasonable to do so based on what AEG knew about him at the time, and that Murray's actions in the bedroom, not AEG's business decisions, were the direct cause of death. Katherine Jackson didn't get the verdict she was looking for. But the trial left behind a public record of internal communications that still shapes how people read this case today, because it's one thing to say a doctor made catastrophic decisions alone in a room. It's another to see, in writing, that people around Jackson had concerns and kept the machine running anyway. And then there's the version of this story that lives entirely outside courtrooms, in the space where grief and disbelief tend to grow. Theories that facts can't fully starve out. In the days after Jackson's death, a specific rumor spread with startling speed. The idea that Michael Jackson wasn't actually dead at all. That the singer, exhausted by decades of relentless scrutiny, had staged his own death and disappeared, the way tabloids had joked he might for years. Online communities dedicated to this idea have pointed to details as small as a misspelled word on his death certificate, or a hearse that supposedly left the coroner's office at an unusual hour, treating every minor inconsistency in a chaotic, high-profile death as proof of a larger deception, rather than the ordinary friction of a process happening under unprecedented media pressure. It's understandable, in a strange way, why that theory took hold. Jackson's life had already blurred the line between reality and spectacle so many times: plastic surgery speculation, custody disputes, decades of tabloid myth-making, that his actual death almost felt like it needed a twist to match everything that came before it. But there's no credible evidence supporting it. No unexplained sightings that have held up to scrutiny. No forensic gap. Nothing beyond the very human instinct to reject an ending that feels too small for a life that large. 15 years on, autopsy findings, a documented body, a funeral, and a body of legal proceedings involving his estate all point the same direction. He died on June 25, 2009, exactly where and how the coroner said he did. This theory belongs less to the case itself and more to what people needed to believe in the immediate shock of losing him. The more serious, more persistent theory isn't about Jackson being alive. It's about who else, beyond Conrad Murray, bears responsibility for what happened in that bedroom. Some point to Jackson's well-documented years-long relationship with prescription drugs, tracing back to painkillers prescribed after a 1984 accident during a Pepsi commercial shoot, and ask whether Murray was simply the last in a long line of doctors who enabled a dependency that had been building for a quarter of a century, rather than its sole architect. Others point squarely at the financial pressure of the tour itself, at a 50-date commitment that made Michael Jackson, at that moment, worth more to more people, alive and performing, than he had been in over a decade, and ask whether that pressure created an environment where warning signs were something to manage rather than something to stop and address. The most extreme version of this theory goes further, pointing to that $17.5 million insurance policy and to the millions in advance costs already sunk into rehearsals, staging, and marketing, and suggesting without direct evidence that someone connected to the production had a financial incentive that ran counter to Jackson's health. It's important to be precise here. No court, no investigation, and no credible reporting has ever produced evidence that anyone wanted Jackson to die or that his death was anything other than the result of Murray's specific documented actions in that bedroom. The jury in the AEG civil trial heard this exact argument and rejected it, finding the company not liable. But the theory persists online in part because the underlying facts, the salary, the insurance policy, the ignored warning email, are all real, verifiable, and undisputed, even if the conclusion drawn from them isn't supported by any legal finding. Neither of these explanations replaces the jury's finding about Murray's direct actions, but they widen the frame around it, and that widened frame is largely why this case still generates conversation, debate, and, yes, tens of millions of searches, more than 15 years after a jury already reached a verdict. In the years since, Jackson's estate has become one of the highest-earning in entertainment history. Generating more in posthumous revenue through catalog sales, the Cirque du Soleil productions built around his music, and licensing deals than Jackson often earned while he was alive and struggling under the weight of debt and legal battles in his final years. Executors John Branca and John McClane, the two men Jackson named in a will drafted years earlier, have overseen a transformation of his financial legacy that even critics acknowledge has been extraordinarily effective, even as some family members, including his father Joe Jackson before his own death, publicly questioned decisions made about the estate. It's a strange coda to this case. The same man whose final weeks were defined by financial pressure and rushed rehearsals became, in death, more financially secure than he had been in years. Managed by executors instead of doctors, generating income instead of needing it. Whether that irony means anything, or is simply how estates work when a catalog as valuable as Jackson's finally gets professional management, is something people continue to debate right alongside the question of what happened in that bedroom. Conrad Murray himself never fully disappeared from public view. After his release from prison in 2013, he gave interviews maintaining that he had done nothing to cause Jackson's death, at one point suggesting Jackson may have swallowed additional pills himself in the moments Murray wasn't watching, an account that echoes the defense's rejected theory from trial and that Jackson's family has called an attempt to shift blame away from the one person a jury already found responsible. Murray has never regained his medical license. Meanwhile, less than 5 months after Jackson's death, a film assembled from hundreds of hours of rehearsal footage, including that final June 23 performance of Human Nature, was rushed into theaters under the title This Is It, and became one of the highest-grossing concert documentaries ever released, giving millions of people their only chance to see, in something close to real time, exactly how close Jackson had actually come to the comeback that was supposed to define the rest of his career. Here's the detail that brings this story back to where it started. 2 days before Michael Jackson died, on June 23, 2009, he stood on that stage at the Forum and ran through Human Nature one final time, the last full rehearsal of his career, the last time the world would see him move through choreography he'd been perfecting since he was a young man, reinventing himself for the first of many times. Nobody in that room that night knew it was the last time. The people who filmed it, the dancers around him, even Jackson himself believed they were 40-something days away from the biggest stage of his life, not 48 hours away from the end of it. That gap, between what everyone in that rehearsal room believed was coming and what was actually 2 nights away, is maybe the most unsettling detail in this entire case, because it means the final image the world has of Michael Jackson alive isn't a man in decline. It's a man rehearsing a quarter-century-old song about wondering why the world works the way it does, getting ready for a comeback that was never going to happen. There's a strange symmetry in that image, a song called Human Nature, built around a lyric asking why the world works the way it does, why people react the way they react, running through his mind and his body one last time, 2 nights before Human Nature in its ugliest, most negligent form, killed him. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Someone who wants the full timeline, not just the headline. There's another case coming soon that's even harder to reconcile than this one, so if you want to be here when it drops, subscribe now before you go. And if this video helped you actually understand what happened in that room, instead of just what you'd already heard secondhand, that's the whole point of this channel. So consider sticking around for what's next.